They said the Vampire King did not cast a shadow. Children in the villages surrounding his mountain spoke of him in whispers, hiding behind their mothers' skirts whenever clouds gathered over the black stone fortress cut into the cliff. He was old as the ruined forests, older than the crumbling roads that wound up toward his throne. Merchants swore that if you looked too long at his gate, you could feel your blood slow, as though the stones themselves were hungry. They told stories because they were afraid, and stories are how fear keeps itself warm. In the village of Ilana, where the river bent like a silver arm around the wheat fields, a girl named Merin grew up with those stories. She learned them from the baker's wife and the blacksmith and her schoolmates. She learned that he drank the blood of travelers, that he had a hoard of bones in his dining hall, that his eyes glowed red as burning coals. Her mother never told those stories. When Merin was little, barely tall enough to see over the table, she had once found her mother standing by the single window of their small house, looking up toward the distant mountain. The late sun had turned the cliffs copper and gold, but the fortress carved into the rock remained dark, a shadow against the sky. Is the Vampire King really as terrible as they say? Merin had asked, pressing her cheek against her mother's patched skirt. Her mother had not answered right away. She had only reached down and gently smoothed Merin's hair, her fingers trembling just enough for Merin to notice even then. People fear what they do not understand, her mother said at last. Not everything that looks frightening is cruel. Merin had waited, sensing there was more, but her mother's mouth had pressed into a line, and her eyes had grown distant. After that, if Merin asked about the fortress, her mother would simply say, "Stay away from that mountain, my heart. Promise me." So Merin promised. She promised because she loved her mother, and because their life was already fragile enough without seeking danger. They were poor. Not the romantic kind of poor that stories sometimes dressed in ribbons and resilience, but the kind that made bones show at wrists and knuckles, the kind that meant they counted coppers 3 times before buying flour. Her mother washed clothes for the larger houses and sometimes walked to neighboring farms to help with harvest, returning with bruises on her shoulders and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Merin grew, learned to read from an old priest who visited once a month, learned to mend seams, to pull laughter from thin air so her mother would worry less. She listened to the river and the wind and the stories, all the stories but the ones her mother never finished. And then, one early autumn when the river ran low and the wheat failed, her mother grew sick. It started with a cough. A small thing, harmless at first, just a roughness in her voice. But the nights grew colder, and the cough grew harsher. Soon it stole her breath and painted her lips blue at the edges. The village healer did what she could, but her herbs were few that year, and sickness, like hunger, does not always listen to skill. Merin watched her mother's cheeks sink and her eyes grow brighter and fevered. She watched as the woman who had carried buckets of water on each hip now could not carry herself from bed to chair. And as she watched, a quiet terror built in her chest, rising with each rattling breath her mother drew. One crisp morning, when the frost had traced white lace over their small window, her mother took Merin's hand and squeezed it with surprising strength. "You must promise me one more thing," she whispered. Merin's throat had been too tight to speak, but she nodded. "In the bottom of my chest," her mother said, wrapped in the old blue shawl, "there is a small painting. If I am gone, and you find yourself with nowhere to go, no one to keep you safe, take that painting and go to the fortress." Merin stared at her. "To the Vampire King." "To Lorien," her mother said, and for the first time Merin heard the king's name spoken without fear. It sounded old and soft on her mother's tongue, like a secret word worn smooth by many years. Her mother's gaze turned toward the ceiling, as if she could see through roof and cloud and stone to the distant mountain. "Show it to him. He will not turn you away." "Why?" Merin whispered. "Who is he to us?" Her mother's eyes closed. Her fingers loosened around Merin's hand. When she answered, her voice was barely a breath. "Once, he was kind." The last word faded like smoke on the air. After that, there were no more stories. The village did what villages do. They gathered firewood and food, they helped Merin build a small pyre by the river, they murmured prayers as the smoke rose into the bright, endless sky. There were embraces, and there was the careful counting of coins and promises of spare loaves from the baker. But death is heavy, and poverty is heavier still. After a few days, life in Ilana slid back toward its usual channels, leaving Merin standing on the worn bridge over the river, feeling as though everyone she had ever been was dissolving downstream. Days turned into weeks. The harvest was poor, and the winter came early, sharp and unforgiving. The landlord came knocking with apologies but no mercy. The house was needed for a family with more coin. The baker could spare bread only twice a week. The washerwomen already had more hands than work. The blacksmith gave her odd tasks when he could, but there is only so much a hungry girl of 16 can carry or lift. One evening, after being turned away from yet another door, Merin returned to the small house that had been her home, now nearly emptied of her life. Her mother's few dresses were folded in a single bundle. The clay cups her father had made before he left and never returned sat in a neat row on the shelf. A chill had settled into the walls. She lit a candle and knelt by the old wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid and breathed in the faint scent of her mother's lavender soap. There, beneath a worn blue shawl mended many times over, she found it, a small wooden frame, edges smoothed by fingers, the paint slightly cracked with age. Merin lifted the painting into the candlelight. It showed a woman younger than her mother had been at the end, but still recognizable, the same dark eyes, the same smile that was full but tinged with sadness. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders, and behind her was not the rough plaster of their cottage but the soft shadow of carved stone, lit by candle flames. What made Merin's breath catch was not her mother's face, but the other figure in the painting. Standing just behind her mother, one hand resting almost but not quite on her shoulder, was a man. His hair was black as wet ink, falling to his shoulders. His features were fine, nearly delicate, yet there was something in the set of his jaw that spoke of old, quiet authority. His eyes, though rendered in careful strokes of paint, seemed almost to glow, a grey so pale it was nearly silver. He wore a high-collared coat that gleamed like polished obsidian. She knew that face. Everyone in the villages did, though few had seen it in life. It appeared in old etchings and half-faded frescoes in the shrine. It gazed down in warnings painted on the side of traveling wagons. The Vampire King. Lorien. Merin traced the edge of the painting with one fingertip, feeling an eerie calm settle over her. Her mother's last words echoed in her ears. Once, he was kind. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. Snow had begun to fall, soft and insistent, hiding the worn tracks in the road. The landlord had given her until morning to vacate. Somewhere above the village, carved into the mountain, a fortress waited. A monster waited. Or something else. Fear rose in her, bitter and bright. Any sane person would tear the painting in half, throw it into the fire, and scrape together an existence in the village until they starved or married or were taken on as someone's servant. Merin placed the painting carefully into her satchel. She did not consider herself brave. She considered herself alone. Sometimes, that is enough to move a person where courage might not. At dawn, before the village fully woke, Merin stood at the edge of Ilona with her satchel slung over her shoulder, her mother's blue shawl wrapped around her, and watched the sky lighten over the black line of the mountain. Her breath came in small puffs of white. The path up to the fortress was little more than a scar along the stone, winding through stunted trees and over crumbling ledges. "Mother," she whispered to the cold air, "if this is madness, forgive me." The mountain did not answer. Mountains seldom do. But the wind eased for a moment, and that small gentleness was enough to let her take her first step. The climb was not easy. The path grew steeper than she had expected, the air thinner. Her legs burned, and her fingers stung. The villages below became toy houses, the river a slip of silver. Twice, she slipped on loose stones and scraped her palms, once catching herself just in time on a twisted root before she would have slid down the slope. As she climbed, she passed signs that others did not come here often. Branches grew across the path. Moss had begun to reclaim old stones carved with warnings in a language she could not read. Once, she saw the bones of some animal half buried in leaves, scattered and clean, not gnawed but laid out as though someone had arranged them. She paused only once, leaning against a rock, chest heaving. In the clear air, she could hear the distant ringing of the village's single bell. It sounded impossibly far away. "No one climbs to him and returns," the blacksmith had told a group of boys last winter, their faces bathed in orange light from his forge. "Remember that, if your feet ever turn mountainward. The king likes his solitude. And his feasts." Merin did not feel like a feast. She felt like a leaf, small and trembling. Yet still she climbed. It was near midday when she rounded the last bend and saw the fortress. It was not quite as the stories had painted it. Yes, it was large, and yes, it was carved directly into the face of the cliff, its black stone set with narrow windows like watching eyes. But there were no spikes, no dangling chains, no banners sewn from human skin as some tales had claimed in gleeful horror. The gate was tall and arched, made of dark metal worked into patterns that reminded her of bare branches against a winter sky. There was a courtyard of sorts, paved with flat stones, a dry fountain at its center. Thin moss grew between the cracks. No guards patrolled the walls. No torches burned. It was very, very quiet. Merin's steps echoed as she crossed the courtyard. The sound made her feel suddenly exposed. She half expected an arrow to fly from one of the tall windows, or for the gate to swing open of its own accord. Instead, nothing happened. She reached the gate and hesitated. Up close, she could see that its metal was not black at all, but a deep iron gray, smoothed by hands long gone. At its center was an iron ring, cold and heavy when she reached for it. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and struck it against the gate. The sound rolled through the air like a low bell, then faded. For a long moment, there was only the whisper of wind along the cliff. Merin's heart pounded in her ears. She counted her breaths, 1, 2, 3, up to 20, then raised the ring to strike again. Before metal could meet stone, the gate shifted beneath her hands. It did not swing open with a creak, as in stories, nor did it groan. It simply gave way, parting inward on silent hinges to reveal a wide, shadowed hall lit by pale light from high windows. Merin stepped back, clutching her satchel. The air that flowed out from the fortress was cool but not icy, carrying a faint scent of old stone and something like dried herbs. "Enter," a voice said. It was not loud. It did not thunder. It was level and clear, and it carried in it something that made Merin's knees want to bow and her feet want to flee at once. She tasted age in it, and patience, and an edge of wariness. She swallowed. Her voice came out too small. She tried again. "I seek the king." "I am here," the voice replied. "Come inside. The mountain wind is unkind to those with warm blood." There was no threat in the words, though they could have been. Merin stepped over the threshold. The hall was wider than any room she had ever seen. Its floor was polished stone, worn smooth by centuries of feet. Tall columns rose to a ceiling lost in shadow, their surfaces carved with leaves, stars, and spirals. The light from the narrow windows was pale, almost silver, throwing long shafts across the floor. At the far end of the hall, the figure of a man stood waiting. He was exactly as in the painting, and yet not. His hair was black, his skin pale, his features fine. His eyes, in life, were not glowing red embers but a grey so light they seemed almost colourless. They were not cruel, but they were tired. There were faint lines at their corners, the sort that come from squinting into light or gazing too long at horizons. He wore a long black coat over a simple dark shirt, no crown, no jewels. There was a ring on his right hand, carved from some dark stone veined with silver. His hands were bare and still. He watched her approach with a hawk's stillness. Merin's legs felt numb. Each step was an act of will. She stopped several paces from him and bowed because it felt like the only thing to do. "Your Majesty," she managed. "Lorien," he corrected, almost absently. His voice in the wide hall sounded softer than it had at the gate. "Titles are for courts. I have no court." She lifted her head. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. She knew he could hear her heart beating, she felt it thudding against her ribs like a frightened bird. His gaze flicked over her threadbare shawl, her worn boots, the satchel clutched in her white-knuckled hands. "You came alone," he observed. "There is no one else to come with me," she replied, before she could think to make her words more careful. Her voice echoed off the high ceiling and sounded braver than she felt. One corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a frown. "Few climb to my door without fear," he said. "Fewer still admit they have none to stand beside them." Merin took a breath. The air in the hall felt strangely still, yet not suffocating. "I was told you would not turn me away." "By whom?" His tone did not change, but his eyes sharpened. She reached into her satchel, her fingers brushing the worn wood of the frame, and drew out the small painting. The motion felt slow, heavy with meaning. There was a silence in the room now that hummed, as though the very stones were listening. She held the painting out, both hands supporting it. "My mother," she said. Her voice shook. She hated that it shook, but she could not help it. She said, "If I had nowhere else to go, I should show you this." For a heartbeat, 1, 2, 3, Lorien did not move. His face was unreadable, carved from some calm, distant marble. Then he stepped forward, with a grace that was almost too smooth to be human, and took the painting from her. His fingers, when they brushed against hers, were cool. Not freezing, not icy, but the coolness of river stones in shade. He lowered his gaze to the painting. The change was subtle. His shoulders, always slightly drawn back as if held by invisible strings of duty, loosened a fraction. His breath, did he breathe, caught. A flicker, like the memory of firelight, crossed his pale eyes. "This," he said, so quietly that Merin almost did not hear him, "I have not seen in years." His thumb traced the edge of the woman's painted face. Her name, he asked without looking up, was Lysa. Was it not? Merin's throat closed. "Yes." "And you," he added, still studying the painting as though it might change under his gaze, "are Merin." It was not a question. "How do you know my name?" she whispered. Now he did look up, and for the first time his eyes met hers not as a king assessing a petitioner, but as a person peering through layers of memory. There was something like sorrow there, and something like tenderness, old and bound up in loss. "She spoke of you," he said. "Once, long ago. When you were only a hope, barely a thought." His gaze returned briefly to the painting. "She asked me, if ever our paths crossed again, to watch over you. If you should come." The hall seemed to tilt gently around Merin. "You knew my mother?" Lorien's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering. "She saved my life," he said simply. Merin blinked. Of all the tales she had heard, that had never been one of them. "How?" she asked, the word bursting from her like a held breath. She was just a washerwoman, a village girl. "She never?" He lifted a hand, not sharply, but enough to stem her questions for a moment. "There is time," he said. "You are cold, and I suspect you have not eaten today. Walk with me." He turned and began to move down the hall, his steps nearly silent on the stone. After a moment's hesitation, Merin followed. No guards appeared, no servants bustled. It struck her as strange that a place this large should echo with only the sound of two sets of footsteps. As they walked, Lorien spoke, not looking at her. "Your mother," he said, "came here once, many years ago. Not by climbing the path as you did, but by stumbling in with a group of refugees fleeing a war that has already been forgotten by most who did not bleed in it." His voice held no bitterness, only a weary familiarity with such patterns. "They were attacked on the road," he continued. "Wolves driven mad by hunger, men driven mad by fear. When they finally reached my gate, there were fewer than had left the city. I took them in." Merin glanced sideways at him. "The stories say you do not take anyone in. They say you drain their blood and hang their bodies from the walls." A faint, almost amused huff escaped him. Stories must feed themselves somehow. The truth is often less satisfying to those who hunger for horror. He led her through an archway into a smaller hall, then into a room where a long table stood near another narrow window. Dust motes floated in the pale light. On the table were a simple clay pitcher and a loaf of bread dark with crust. Merin's stomach twisted painfully at the sight of food. Lorien gestured to a chair. "Sit." She obeyed. Her fingers fumbled slightly as she reached for the bread, but she waited, unsure if she should start before he did. "Eat," he said quietly. I require different sustenance than you." He poured water from the pitcher into a cup and set it before her. "This is for you." Merin tore a small piece of bread, hesitated, then took a bite. It was denser than the baker's white loaves, but soft and warm. The taste flooded her with a hunger she had been trying not to pay attention to. She ate slowly, conscious of his gaze but too empty to stop. "You took them in," she prompted between careful sips of water. "My mother and the others." "I did." Lorien's eyes drifted to the window. "It amused me, in those days, that people assumed I craved constant slaughter. The truth is, I have spilled enough blood for 10 lifetimes. Taking in 16 frightened humans did not trouble me. They stayed here through the winter, until the snows began to melt and the roads grew passable." He folded his hands on the table. His fingers were long, the veins beneath his pale skin faintly visible. "Your mother," he went on softly, "arrived with a fever. She had been tending to the injured, neglecting a wound of her own. She was burning when they carried her over my threshold. The others assumed she would die." Merin's grip tightened around her cup. She imagined her mother younger, weaker, carried in by strangers into this place. "But she did not," Merin said, "because she was here, her existence that proof." No, a faint smile touched his mouth, fleeting and almost startled, as though it had appeared without his permission. "She did not. She fought like someone who was not ready to have their story end." His gaze flicked to Merin, then away. "I had lived a very long time by then," he murmured. "I had seen more deaths than I care to remember. Yet when they brought her to me, something," he trailed off, searching for a word. "Something in her was familiar. I had known bright souls like hers a long time ago, before the curse that made me what I am. To see that light again, in my hall." He shook his head once, as if to clear it. "I sat at her bedside for 3 nights, he said. I gave her what remedies I had left from the days when healers still visited me. I made sure she drank, that she did not slip away when no one looked." His voice turned wry. The refugees thought it some strange whim. They did not question a gift they did not understand. "You saved her," Merin whispered. "Perhaps," he allowed. "But on the 3rd night, when she woke fully, it was she who saved me." He rose then, restless, and moved to stand by the window. The light turned his pale skin almost translucent, yet his shadow fell clearly on the floor. "I had grown weary," he said quietly. "You must understand, when you live as long as I have, when every decade brings new wars and new cruelties from mortal hands, the temptation to simply withdraw grows stronger. To close the gates and let the world spin itself to ruin without you. I had done harm in my younger centuries. Things the stories do not forget. I thought that by hiding here, I could at least stop adding to the tally." His fingers curled slightly against the stone of the window sill. "But hiding is not the same as atonement," he continued. "It is merely absence. Emptiness. I told myself I was being merciful by staying away from humans. In truth, I was protecting only myself, from guilt, from grief, from the burden of choice." He turned his head slightly, just enough for Merin to see the profile of his face, sharpened by light, softened by the weight of memory. "Your mother would not allow that," he said, and there was a hint of bewildered admiration in his tone. "Even as she recovered, she insisted on helping. mending clothes for the others, stirring the cauldrons in the kitchen, sweeping the very floors of this hall. She moved as if she had always belonged here. She laughed. The word seemed to startle him. I had not heard laughter in this place in longer than you have been alive. The room felt warmer as he spoke, as though the memory brought a faint echo of that past winter's fires. She was not afraid of me, he went on. Or rather, she was, at first. Anyone with sense is. But fear did not rule her. Once, when she found me brooding in the upper library, she said, his lips quirked, and this time the smile reached his eyes briefly. She said I reminded her of a child sulking in the corner at a village dance because he did not know the steps and would rather scowl than ask to be taught. Merin's mouth fell open slightly. She could almost hear her mother's teasing tone. You, she blurted, before she could stop herself. Sulking at a dance? Not at a dance, he corrected dryly. Brooding in a fortress. But the principle, he conceded, was perhaps not entirely inaccurate. Silence settled between them for a few heartbeats, comfortable this time. She told me, he said, his voice returning to that quiet evenness, that kindness is not only in grand gestures. That it is also in small choices, taken again and again, even when no one sees. She said that if I truly believed I could not be anything but a monster, then hiding away did no one any good. That if I wanted to make amends for the harm I had done, and I did, though I had not admitted it aloud, then I must start by doing what good I could, where I could, without expectation of forgiveness. Merin felt an ache rise in her chest. That sounds like her, she whispered. She would give the last of her bread to someone hungrier, then scold them for not taking care of themselves sooner. Lorien nodded once, slowly. She stayed until spring, he said. In that time, she changed this place. She cleaned rooms that had not been opened in decades. She planted herbs in the courtyard, in cracked pots and old jars. She painted that. He gestured with the painting toward the hall. Merin frowned, confused. You let her? I did not, he admitted with a faint, rueful tilt of his head, no until it was nearly finished. I woke one evening to find she had dragged a stool into the corridor and was standing on it, paintbrush between her teeth, dabbing color onto the wall. When I asked what she was doing, she said, if you will insist on living in the world's shadow, Lorien, the least you can do is let some color in. His gaze slipped toward a far archway. The painting on the wall remains. Time has dulled its hues, but I have not allowed it to fade entirely. Merin swallowed, a strange blend of grief and comfort welling up inside her. To know her mother's hands had touched these stones, that her laughter had echoed in these halls, it made the fortress feel less alien. Why did she leave? Merin asked softly. Why did she never tell me? Her voice broke. She covered her eyes briefly with her hand. Lorien was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his words were careful. She left, he said, because she believed it was right. The war had ended. The roads, though still dangerous, were open. She did not want to hide here forever. She wanted the simple life. A family. A place she could belong without the weight of my history hanging over her. He glanced at Merin, and in his gaze she read a question he did not voice. Do you begrudge her that? I don't, she whispered, more to herself than to him. I just wish I had known. That someone like you, she bit her tongue, flushing. I mean, that someone like me was bound to her by more than fear, he finished for her, without offense. You are not wrong to struggle with that. The world prefers its monsters simple and its loves uncomplicated. He looked down at the painting of Lysa again. Before she left, she made me promise that if ever she, or those she loved, should need sanctuary, I would offer it. No questions asked. His thumb brushed the wood. I am not accustomed to breaking my word. A strange, thin thread of hope uncoiled in Merin's chest. So you will let me stay? She asked, trying not to sound too desperate. I can work. I can clean, or cook, or... He raised a hand, stopping her. This is not a bargain you must strike like a merchant, he said gently. You came here because you had nowhere else to go. That is enough. She stared at him. The king whom people painted as a nightmare on their children's walls sat across from her at a plain table, his hands folded, his eyes, ancient and weary and oddly kind, frank upon her face. Why, she whispered. You don't even know me. I know more than you think. His gaze was steady. You climbed a mountain alone in winter, with a painting in your bag and fear in your bones. You walked through my gate instead of turning back. You listened when your mother asked you to trust someone she called a monster. That tells me a few things. He paused, then added, and I knew your mother. That, in truth, is all the reason I need. Something in Merin's chest unclenched with a soft, painful release. Her eyes stung. She blinked quickly, but one tear escaped, tracking down her cheek. Lorian's gaze dropped briefly to the tear, then returned to her eyes. He did not comment, did not offer a handkerchief or a grand gesture of comfort. He simply sat, allowing her the space to breathe. This place is, she glanced around. Empty. Mostly, he agreed. There are a few others, like you, who drifted here with nowhere else to go. A stonemason who lost his hands in an accident and was cast out as useless. A widow from the south whom war left with no home but scars. A faint shadow crossed his features. They stay in the lower rooms. You will meet them in time, if you wish. You shelter them, she said slowly. I offered them a roof and food, he corrected, almost reflexively. That is hardly the heroism your tales devote themselves to. But they think you're a monster, Merin pressed, needing to understand. If they knew, if anyone knew what you do here, who you really are. They would come with torches, he finished mildly. Or they would come with need, more need than even a life as long as mine could meet. Or they would come with hope of the sort that asks me to solve what only humans together can mend. And when I could not, their hope would curdle into hatred. It has happened before. He leaned back slightly in his chair. It is easier, for all of us, if I remain the thing in the dark. Let them fear my name and turn their children away from these cliffs. It keeps most of them safe. That is enough. Is it? Merin asked, the word slipping out before she could stop it. He regarded her with something like curiosity. Is what? Enough, she said. To help people only in secret. To let the whole world believe you're cruel when you're, she faltered, searching for a word that did not feel too fragile. When you're not. His smile, when it came, was sad and genuine. Cruelty and kindness are not absolutes, he said quietly. In my youth, I was both, in dizzying measure. I have burned villages and I have rebuilt them. I have taken lives and spared them. The stories you heard were not all lies. I do not deserve their praise. But if their fear of me keeps a reckless warlord from marching through your valley, if the rumors of my thirst make a slaver think twice before taking the northern road, he lifted one shoulder. Then I accept the shadows on my name as one more way to serve. Merin thought of the blacksmith's tales, of the children's shivering delight at imagined horrors. She thought of the way travelers sometimes turned back from the higher paths, muttering about the king's hunger. You let them believe, she murmured. So they'll stay away from things that might harm them. And from me, he added. It is not only I who am dangerous in these mountains. Old magics sleep under the snow. There are things I cannot always control. If I must be the warning carved over the door to keep people from wandering in where they could vanish forever, so be it. He rose then, as if the conversation had run long enough for one afternoon. Merin realized suddenly how tired she was, how the climb and the fear and the weight of her grief were all settling into her bones now that she had stopped moving. I will show you a room, he said. Rest this day. Tomorrow, if you wish, you can help Mara in the kitchen. She will be glad of another pair of hands that do not tremble as much as mine when I try to knead bread. She almost laughed at the image of this ancient, feared king fumbling with dough. The sound that left her lips was small but real. He inclined his head, that faint not-quite smile tugging at his mouth again. They walked through more corridors, some lined with old tapestries faded to ghosts of color, others bare and clean. In one, Merin caught sight of a mural painted directly onto the stone, a swirl of flowers, a river, a flock of birds. The style was unmistakable. She stopped, reaching out as though to touch it, then pulling her hand back at the last moment. My mother, she said softly. Yes. Lorien's voice held a note of something like reverence. She insisted this hall felt like a tomb. I did not argue. I had no right. Merin studied the brushstrokes, imagining her mother standing here with paint smudged on her fingers, humming under her breath. Tears pricked her eyes again. This time, she did not bother to blink them away. You cared for her, she said, not a question. Not just as the guest. His silence spoke louder than any words. At length, he answered, very much. Did she care for you? He was quiet for so long that Merin thought he might not reply. When he did, his voice was soft. In her way, he said. But her heart was not meant to live in these halls forever. It would have withered here, as mine nearly did, once. She knew that. I knew that. So we did a difficult, kind thing, instead of an easy, selfish one. He turned then, meeting her gaze fully. The fact that you are here, he added gently, tells me she found a measure of the life she wanted. Merin's hand clenched in the folds of the blue shawl around her shoulders. She was happy, I think, she murmured. Even when it was hard. She used to say. Some days, Merin, happiness is loud and sparkling. Some days it's very quiet, like warm soup and dry socks and someone remembering how you take your tea. Wise woman, Lorien said. Annoyingly so, at times. Merin smiled through her tears. She could be stubborn. Oh, I remember, he replied. She once lectured me for an hour because I refused to let a child bring a stray fox inside. You can shelter an entire village, she said, but one small animal is too much. What did you do? Merin asked, picturing the scene. I built the fox a shelter in the courtyard, he admitted, and allowed it inside during storms, under strict supervision. It bit me twice. Merin laughed then, a proper, startled laugh. The sound bounced off the stone and seemed to surprise them both. Lorien's expression softened. For a moment, there was no vampire king and no poor village girl, only two people tied to the same absent center of gravity. He showed her to a small room overlooking the lower slopes of the mountain. It contained a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a chair by a window. The blankets were clean, the linen smelling faintly of dried thyme. If you need anything, he said, lingering in the doorway, there is a bell pull by the bed. It does not ring servants, it rings me. I am usually awake. Merin's hand hovered near the cord. I don't want to trouble you. He almost smiled. You have already troubled my solitude by existing within these walls. A bell will make little difference. His gaze flicked once more to her face, then he inclined his head and withdrew. The days that followed were strange, but not in the ways Merin had expected. She met Mara, a stout woman with sun-browned skin and laugh lines so deep they cut through even her moments of quiet. Mara gave her a wooden spoon and thickly described the layout of the kitchens, the storerooms, the way the ovens like to be coaxed with certain kinds of wood. She waved away Merin's apologies for mistakes with a flick of her wrist. Lorien will not starve if the stew is too salty, she said. I, however, have opinions. She met Alan, the stonemason, who showed her how to mend cracks in the walls with careful, patient hands. He talked little, but when he did, his words were careful and kind. She met Rena, the widow, who moved with a limp and carried with her a light like banked coals. Rena taught Merin how to keep the fireplaces going in the coldest corridors, how to lay the wood so that the smoke would not choke the halls. Sometimes, in the evenings, Merin would see Lorien in the library, reading by the glow of a single oil lamp. He always sat in the same high-backed chair, a book resting lightly in his hands. Sometimes he would look up as she passed and nod, sometimes he would seem so lost in whatever old tale or record he was studying that he did not notice her at all. She never saw him eat. Once, she waked in the middle of the night and, unable to sleep, wandered into the courtyard. There, beneath a sky scattered with stars, she saw him at the far edge, where the stone dropped away into darkness. He was standing motionless, his face tilted up to the sky, his eyes closed. The wind tugged at his coat, at his hair, but he did not move. His silhouette was carved against the starlight. Merin watched from the shadow of a column. There was something sacred in the stillness of his posture, some quiet ritual she did not want to disturb. After a while, he opened his eyes and turned slightly, as though sensing her. "You will catch cold," he said, not unkindly. "So will you," she replied, then flushed. "I mean, I do not," he said, "suffer from cold the way you do." He gestured to her shawl. "Your mother's?" "Yes." She wrapped it tighter. "It still smells like her. Or maybe I just tell myself that. Memories have their own sense," he murmured. "Sometimes we borrow the nearest thing to carry them." She joined him at the wall, carefully keeping a respectful distance. From here she could see the faint glimmer of the river, the tiny cluster of lights that was Ilona. The sight stirred something in her, a mixture of homesickness and relief, like seeing a closed door to a room you had already cleared of your belongings. "Do you ever go down?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "When storms are coming. Or when those with swords and arrogance travel too close to your valley. It is not public knowledge." "The storms?" she asked, puzzled. He regarded the sky. "There are things in these mountains," he said slowly, "that wake during certain kinds of storms. Old things, bound by magics even older than I am. If the wrong kind of wind blows at the wrong time, if the wrong words are spoken," his hands rested on the stone, his fingers splayed. "I have ways of turning such storms aside. Of quieting restless things." "You protect them," Merin said, looking down toward the sleeping village. "If you like," he replied, as though it were a small matter. "I told you, I do what good I can, where I can. It is not enough to erase what I have done. But it is something." They stood in silence for a while, watching their breaths rise in faint puffs. A shooting star streaked faintly across the sky, so distant that it might have been no more than a trick of her eyes. "Do they know?" she asked softly. "The people in the village. Do they know you care if a storm might harm them?" No, his answer was simple. "They must not. If they did, they would come to my door with every misfortune. They would ask me to mend their broken tools, their broken hearts, their broken systems. And I cannot. Not always. I am not a god. I am only a man who made terrible choices and now tries, in small ways, to make better ones." Merin thought of the baker, his kind eyes, the way his face had hardened when anyone mentioned the fortress. She thought of the blacksmith's tales. It was strange to hold both images in her mind, the fearful stories and the man standing beside her, watching over the valley like a tired, stubborn guardian. "Thank you," she said quietly. It felt insufficient, but it was all she had. He glanced at her with mild surprise. "For what?" "For the storms. For Mara and Alan and Rena. For my mother." Her throat tightened. "For being here." "You owe me no thanks," he said. "I do what I do because I must. Because I could not live with myself otherwise. Gratitude is not required." "Maybe not by you," she replied. "But by me." He studied her for a moment, then inclined his head in something that felt more like acknowledgement than acceptance. "Go back inside," he said after a time. "Sleep. Tomorrow will be cold. The chimneys will need tending." She obeyed, but as she climbed the stairs back to her room, she felt something shift quietly inside her. The fortress no longer felt like a place outside the world, occupied by a legend. It felt like a strange, hidden organ in the body of the land, pumping small, steady pulses of unseen care through its veins. Winter deepened. Snow lay thick on the mountain paths, drifting against the old warning stones. Inside, fires burned in the hearths. Merin learned the rhythms of the fortress, the way the light fell through certain windows at certain hours, the creak of particular steps, the habits of the others who lived there. She also learned, slowly, to read Lorien's silences. He was not talkative by nature, but he listened. When Mara grumbled about her aching knees, he quietly placed a cushioned stool in the kitchen the next day. When Alan stood too long by the window staring to the east, toward the distant city he had left, Lorien arranged the shelves so that the mason's work would take him to different parts of the fortress, away from that view. Once, when Merin burned her hand on a kettle, he appeared at the door of the kitchen almost immediately, though no one had called him. He crossed the room in 3 swift strides, his movement still carrying that eerie smoothness that reminded her he was not made like other men, and took her wrist gently. His fingers were cool against her skin, the pain easing under his touch. For a moment, she felt not only the physical relief but a strange flutter of something else, a sense of being seen, of being cared for without fuss or condition. "Thank you," she muttered, embarrassed when Mara teased her for her clumsiness. Lorien released her hand, his gaze lingering briefly on the reddened skin now paling. "Be cautious," he said softly. "You only have one body. I have learned that losing one does not feel any better for having another waiting." She opened her mouth to ask what he meant, then closed it. Some questions were not for now. Perhaps not forever. As winter's grip began, at last, to loosen, a storm came unlike the others. It began with a low pressure in the air, a heaviness that made Merin's ears ring. The sky turned the color of bruised fruit. The wind did not whistle as usual through the mountain passes, it moaned, a sound like something old remembering its own name with pain. Lorien was in the courtyard, standing perfectly still, when Merin stepped out, shawl drawn tight. "You should go inside," he said without looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where strange greenish light flickered at the ragged edge of the clouds. "Is it one of those storms?" she asked, her voice small against the mounting wind. "The dangerous ones." "Yes." Can we help?" He shook his head once. "This is not your kind of work." The words might have stung, but his tone held no condescension, only concern. "What will you do?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "What I always do. Sing an old song to old bones. Remind them of their oaths. Ask them, politely, to sleep." Lightning forked in the distance, silent for a moment, then followed by a deep, rolling boom that shuddered through the stone beneath their feet. Merin thought of the village, its thin roofs, its fragile people. Of the healer's hut, the baker's oven, the small shrine. Of the children who hid under their blankets when thunder shook the sky. "Please," she said, though she did not know what she was asking. He looked at her then, truly looked, and in his gaze she saw not only the king and the ancient being, but someone who, long ago, had also stood at windows watching storms and wondering whom they would spare. "I will do what I can," he promised. Then he stepped to the very edge of the courtyard, where the stone fell away. He raised his arms slightly, as if to embrace the storm. His lips moved, but Merin could not hear the words over the rising wind. The air changed. It was subtle at first, like the moment before a held breath. Then the wind seemed to twist, circling around the fortress in a wide, invisible ring. The clouds overhead writhed, their lower bellies torn into long, dark streamers that stretched like fingers. The strange green light flickered and then retreated, as if shy of touching the mountain. Lorien's voice rose, not loud but clear, threading through the thunder like a silver line through dark cloth. The words were in a language Merin did not know, harsh and beautiful, full of the crackle of fire and the press of earth. The wind battered her, pushing her back. Snow whipped against her face. She clung to a pillar, unable to force herself toward him yet unwilling to flee inside. Below, in the valley, she could see the outlines of Ilona blurred by curtains of snow. The river was nearly hidden now, a ghostly ribbon. "Please," she whispered again, though to whom she did not know. The storm surged once more, a last, angry swell, and then it broke. The clouds bunched, rolled, and then slid westward, away from the mountain, away from the valley. The thunder grew more distant. The snow softened into a quieter, more familiar fall. Lorien lowered his arms slowly. His shoulders sagged. For a moment, he swayed on his feet. Merin's heart lurched. She stepped forward without thinking, reaching his side just as his knees threatened to give. He was heavier than he looked, his body denser, like stone carved into human form, but she managed to slip an arm around his waist, bracing him. His skin was cold, truly cold now, like ice pulled from a deep cave. His breath came in shallow pools, each one sounding older than the last. "You said this wasn't my work," she muttered, her teeth chattering as much from fear as from cold. "That doesn't mean you have to do it alone." He chuckled weakly, the sound like cracking frost. "Stubborn," he murmured. "Just like—" He did not finish the sentence, but she knew. "Come," she said. "Lean on me." He allowed it, which frightened her more than any display of power. Together, they made their way back through the archway into the hall, the warmth inside wrapping around them like a blanket. Mara appeared from the kitchen, eyes wide. "By the bones, what did you get up to out there?" she scolded, bustling toward them. "You look like Death's second cousin, Lorien. Sit down before you fall down." "Your storms," Merin said to Mara, half breathless, half exhilarated. "He pushes them away. He keeps them from the valley." Mara snorted, setting a bowl of steaming broth on the table and shoving Lorien toward a chair. "Of course he does. You think I'd stay up on this desolate rock just for the pleasure of his company?" Her eyes softened as she ladled soup into another bowl and pressed it into Merin's hands. "Drink. Both of you. And don't tell him he looks tired, or he'll go stare at the ceiling for 3 hours and mumble about the weight of centuries." Lorien managed a faint, rueful smile as he wrapped his chilled fingers around the bowl. His hands trembled slightly. Merin noticed and looked away, giving him the courtesy of not naming his weakness. Afterward, in the quiet of the nearly empty hall, Merin sat alone for a while, her bowl empty, the warmth slowly returning to her limbs. She thought of the stories that would be told in Ilana tonight, how the storm had seemed ready to tear the village apart, then turned aside at the last moment. Some would call it luck. Some would thank the river spirit or the old gods. No one would say. The vampire king held up his hands and begged the storm to change course, then nearly collapsed from the effort. They would continue to speak of him in fear, around hearths gilded with firelight. They would warn their children not to climb the mountain. They would draw his shadow taller than any tree in their tales. And he would continue, quietly, to do what he could. The thought made Merin's chest ache with a strange, complex feeling she could not name. It held in it gratitude, sorrow, admiration, and a kind of fierce, protective affection she had not expected to feel for someone like him. She rose and walked down the corridor toward the library. She had a feeling she would find him there. The room was lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, crammed with books in languages Merin could not yet read. A fire crackled in the hearth. Lorien sat in his usual high-backed chair, a blanket draped over his shoulders, a concession, perhaps, to Mara's fussing. He looked up as she entered. "I am fine," he he said preemptively, as though he could hear her unspoken worry. The storms take energy. But it returns. That's not what I came to say, she replied. His eyebrow quirked slightly in skepticism. No? No, she moved closer, stopped when she was level with his chair. I wanted to tell you that I know now. That whatever the stories say, they're not the whole truth. They rarely are, he said. He watched her with that steady, curious gaze that seemed to weigh not only her words but the spaces between them. In the village, she went on, they'll keep telling their children you're a monster. They'll keep warning them not to come here. They'll never know about the herb gardens or the foxes in the courtyard or the storms. She took a breath. But I'll know. That and 5 coppers will buy you a loaf of bread, he said dryly. She ignored the comment. I'll know, she repeated. And if anyone ever asks, if they ever wonder if kindness can live in a place like this, in someone like you, her throat tightened. I'll tell them yes. Even if they laugh at me. Even if they don't believe me. He studied her in silence for a long moment. The fire popped softly, sending up a small spray of sparks. You risk making yourself an outsider twice over, he observed at last. First by coming here, then by defending me. She shrugged, a small, careful movement. I was already an outsider. Before. The landlord made sure of that. Poverty does that. Grief does that. She met his eyes squarely, feeling her fear and choosing to speak anyway. I would rather be alone with the truth than together in a lie. Something in his expression shifted, softened. The ancient weariness did not leave, it was too deeply woven, but alongside it a new thread gleamed, approval, quiet and unassuming. Your mother, he said, would be proud. The words hit her like a physical touch. Tears sprang to her eyes. She blinked them away but did not look down. Do you? She hesitated, then plunged on. Do you think she'd be glad I came here? To you? He considered the question, and she was struck again by the way he did not answer lightly, even when a gentle lie might have been easier. I think, he said slowly, that she would wish you had never needed to. That poverty and illness and indifference had not narrowed your path so cruelly. But given that you did need refuge, I think she would be glad you chose a place where someone remembers the sound of her laughter. Merin's breath hitched. She covered her mouth with her hand for a moment, then let it fall. She loved you, she said quietly. It was not truly a question. In her way, he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting. And I loved her, in mine. It did not look like the tales. There was no dramatic rescue, no vows beneath the moon. There was a winter of shared soup and mockery and mending. There were heated arguments about the proper way to plant onions. There was a painting, half finished, and the taste of rosemary on bread. He looked at the fire, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. Love, I have learned, he said, is often not in the moments you remember in songs. It is in the quiet, repetitive acts of care. In letting someone paint your walls in colors you would never have chosen, because it makes them happy. In listening, again, to a story you have heard 10 times already. In watching the road after they're gone, not because you expect them to return, but because some part of you wants to be the first to know if they do. Merin thought of her mother stirring soup, of the way she had always split her last piece of bread with Merin even when she was hungry. of how she had smoothed Merin's hair by the window and refused to speak ill of the fortress. She thought of Lorien standing in the courtyard, arms outstretched to a storm that could tear him apart. "Then you have loved more than most," she said. He made a small, skeptical sound, but did not argue. The fire burned lower. Shadows pooled in the corners of the library, soft and deep. Outside, the wind had gentled to a whisper. "Will you ever tell them?" Merin asked after a while. "Down there. About what you really do. Who you really are." He was quiet for a long time. "Perhaps," he said at last. "To one person. Or two. When the time is right. When it will do more good than harm." Ages turned slowly. Humans are not always kind to those who do not fit neatly into their stories. "It may be," he added with a faint, wry smile, "that I am cowardly. That I am more afraid of their disappointment than their fear." "I don't think you're a coward," Merin said. "Cowards don't stand alone in storms." He inclined his head, accepting the words, if not entirely believing them. "When you go back to your village," he said. She froze. "Do you want me to leave?" He looked honestly taken aback. "No. I meant, if you go. When you choose. This place is not a prison. You are free to stay as long as you like. You are also free to leave. Unlike some legends, I do not bind souls here." She exhaled slowly. "I thought I had nowhere else to go," she said. "But maybe, someday, I'll be ready to see what comes next. To carry her stories, and yours, down the mountain." His gaze held a softness that made him look, for a fleeting moment, almost young. "When that day comes," he said, "you will not go empty-handed. I will see to it." "You've already given me more than you know," she replied. They sat in companionable silence after that, the fire sinking into glowing embers. At some point, Merin's eyes drifted closed. She woke later in her own bed, the blue shawl tucked more firmly around her shoulders, though she had no memory of walking from the library. Perhaps Mara had found her, tutting. Perhaps someone else had. Life in the fortress settled into a gentle rhythm. Seasons shifted. The villagers below continued to tell their children frightening tales about the vampire king who lived above them in the stone, drinking blood and plotting unspeakable things. In time, those children grew, and some of them went to work in distant towns, and some of them married. A few of them, once in a rare while, found their way through misfortune or desperation to the old, narrow path that climbed the mountain. When they reached the gate, cold, afraid, clutching whatever hope they had left, they found it open to them. A tall figure, pale and dark-eyed, would stand in the hall, watching them with a gaze that weighed not their worth but their need. Most would never know about the storms he turned aside, about the nights he walked the high walls humming old songs to the bones of things that must sleep. They would not see the way his hand sometimes trembled after such efforts, or how he would sit in the library afterward, staring not at the words on the page but at some point far beyond. They would know, instead, the warmth of the kitchens, the steady kindness of Mara and Alan and Rena, the quiet presence of a girl with a blue shawl who listened more than she spoke and who, when the name Lorien was mentioned, would smile with a knowledge she did not push on anyone. Years later, when Merin did, in fact, find herself standing once more in the village of Ilana, older now, her hands calloused from work and ink-stained from afternoons spent copying some of Lorien's less dangerous records into forms the villagers could use, she would tell small stories to those who would listen. Not of a vampire king who drank blood under a blood-red moon, but of a man who once built a shelter for a fox because a stubborn woman scolded him. Of storms that changed their minds. Of walls painted with flowers in a place everyone assumed was full only of dust and bones. Some would laugh. Some would shake their heads. A few would listen and, in the privacy of their own hearts, adjust their picture of the world a fraction of an inch. Merin would not try to convince them. She knew that kindness born of fear of punishment was not the kind that built anything lasting. Back up on the mountain, in a fortress carved from old stone, Lorien would go on as he had, feared by many who had never met him, loved quietly by a scattered few, his shadow stretching longer than any human's and yet always falling most gently on those who most needed its shelter. He would still be the subject of frightening tales. He would still sometimes stand alone in the courtyard with his arms spread to the sky, whispering tired, stubborn words to lightning. But in one small room, tucked away near a window that looked down on the winding river, there would be, always, a painting. In it, a young woman smiled with paint-smudged fingers, her hair loose around her shoulders. Behind her stood a man with pale eyes and a not-quite touch on her shoulder. It was not hung in a place of honor, not framed in gold, not displayed like a trophy. It rested on a simple shelf, at a height where a man of ordinary stature could reach it, where a girl of the valley could lift it down and trace the lines of two faces she loved in different ways. In the end, not many would ever know that the fear they carried of the vampire king had, quietly, kept them safe. That while they tightened their shutters and whispered warnings into their children's ears, a pale figure on a high wall watched their roofs with a patient, enduring care. But Merin knew. Lorien knew. And sometimes, in a world that is often louder in its cruelties than its compassions, that quiet knowing is enough to keep a small, stubborn flame of hope alive, the understanding that true kindness can live, unseen, in the heart of even the most feared of beings, and that a shadow on the mountain may, in truth, be the softest shelter of all.